Oh, developing a non-human conlang, the example of something I'm not even going to try to pronounce, so it's all yours.
All right. So I'm Alex. Um, you can see the my like sort of screen name if you want to look at my stuff on Reddit or anything like that. Um, and this is kind of going to be a mixture of advice from me of how I would make a non-human conlang, so a conlang that's spoken by like a fictional species that's, I guess, like that is an animal or communicates through sounds made in a mouth. Um, and then it's also going to be showing sort of how I've applied that in this conlang, which is called yan. And I might have nasalized the second word in there. It's a bit hard for me to switch between voices as fast as they do. So speaking of they, um, hold on. This is designed to be a language for like a sort of fictional sapient kind of bird species, um, not like a sort of bird human hybrid, just like literally a bird that evolved in a very similar way that humans did, sort of like an alternate history, but more like alternate natural history. So my partner Aditi Sharma was kind enough to do sort of a drawing. So picture like a raven with sort of a pied, well, look at it, but it's like a raven with sort of a pied appearance, a lot taller with longer legs. And so this is sort of the species that I developed this conlang for. And when you're doing a conlang like this, when you're doing a conlang in general, but especially if you're doing one for a non-human species, I think it's a good idea to have design principles in mind. So I wanted to go for something that could be produced by completely avian anatomy, obviously, like with a bit of, there isn't a real species, there isn't daws in the way that I'm imagining them. It's an old word for various types of corvids, but daws, as I imagine them, are not real, but they have the same parts of the mouth as crows and ravens and such. So I wanted that anatomical accuracy, but I also wanted it to have sounds that I, as a human, could make. Um, and then I don't really, I was not able to learn too much about the grammatical structure of how actual ravens talk, and obviously they don't have as complex grammatical structure as, say, chickadees or humans. So I just said, okay, I'll make a regular conlang grammar for a kind of human language. And then the last bit is like with that's sort of a hand wave, and this is something that comes up a lot in conlangs in general when you're trying to do naturalism, and also especially if you're doing something sort of alternate uh, species like this, where it's like, oh, if you're doing a fantasy creature, you might say, oh, they look like lizards, but they have human glottises, and I did not want to do something like that with the bird. So all of the uh, all of the like phonation is not produced by some weird mammalian glottis. It's done through the syrinx, like any regular bird, which is like a series of organs near where the trachea meets the two sort of biggest lung pipes. I don't remember what they're called. And that's what real birds use to make sounds. But with this, it's a language. It encodes different meanings with um, things moving around in the mouth, and that brings us to the first section, which is phenology. And you can see there's the raven looking at Prat. Um, so if you the best way to get a sort of a feel for what a bird's mouth is like is to look at a baby which is begging for food. They kind of hold their mouths open. So um, I looked at a lot of pictures of baby crows. Um, but there's also plenty of like sources on anatomy, and I sort of picked out some places of articulation from the existing mouth parts. So like whatever kind of animal or sort of creature you're basing the language on, you could sort of look at what mouth parts are already in your sort of basis. So I there's this sort of opening in the middle of the mouth called the choana, which has these little sort of spikes around it, but it's what connects the nasal cavity to the mouth. So I figured sort of that could be a place of articulation, kind of like the velar or uvular place, because birds don't have a soft palate. Um, but you could also open and close that for nasalization, and I'll get to that later. Then there's the hard palate, and then there's a sort of ridge at the very edge of the beak that I sort of noticed later on, so I didn't end up including it in this language, but I think if you're doing a bird language, you could sort of call that alveolar. Um, Although I was not able to find a name for it. So then just sort of for the if you're doing, yeah, you whatever sort of animal you're looking at, you would look at the mouth parts and you do research on that. I um sort of as a suggestion, if you're doing something for like a reptile, you could look at, how do reptiles make noise? How do snakes make noise? And the hissing that snakes make is actually not made with their tongue, it's made with their glottis. So if you were doing a snake or a reptile language, you might focus on the glottis, stuff like that. So with all of these places of articulation in mind, this is um, uh, the phonemic inventory that I arrived at, and you'll see in brackets, that's the human approximation. So there's no IPA letter. The R is grouped with the M, and there's no IPA letter for clacking your beak together over and over while phonating. Um, so I just showed the orthography and I showed the human pronunciation. So since I don't have a beak to clack together, I just use my tongue. I say r, r, for that sound. Um, and obviously, since it's a bird's language, I wanted to have a lot of different tones. So I kind of went all out in there. Um, there's no rounded vowels or anything. And humans actually have very special muscles that other, even mammals, don't have to make rounded vowels. So um, that's an issue you'd have to look at. But with birds, there aren't any, there's no lips at all. The M cannot appear in an onset. It's just in a coda of a syllable. You close the beak, you continue phonating. Um, um, then I also noticed that bird sounds often, crow's sounds in particular sound kind of nasalized, and that might be a typo. But yeah, creaky sounds, that's sort of what a raven sounds like. And then you might notice for the clicks, the choanal one is notated slightly differently than the palatal and lateral one, and that is actually on purpose. Um, I Since it's in the choanal place of articulation, you wouldn't actually be able to um, that would be closing the sort of choanal passage just by articulating that. So you wouldn't really have you wouldn't be able to nasalize while saying simultaneously. So it's more of a homorganic kind of. So the next section is vocabulary. You can see the bird sort of slotting things into different semantic fields, so to speak. And I just wanted to show off a couple of interesting ones that you would sort of come across if you were a bird and you were trying to describe the world around you. The first one is, and that's sort of a nursery word. And I listen to what baby crows sound like when they're begging for food, and they don't say ma 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 like humans do. They say. So if you want to have nursery words, you have to remember to factor in whatever animal is in the nursery. And then yeah, when birds drink, I think this is not true of some birds, but when most birds drink, they have to tilt their head up to actually swallow the water. So to drink becomes an iterative form of to sort of look up or point up because they don't have arms to point, so they use their faces. And then I also looked a lot into bird vision, and they can actually see some wavelengths that we can't. So like thinking of color terms for a while, I was like, I don't know what to do, but I ended up sort of going in a deep dive into research. And there are certain things that birds would see as brighter color than we would, and they would kind of look like a very bright purple. Um, they wouldn't see yellow dandelions, they would see purple dandelions because certain types of flowers actually reflect wavelengths that humans don't see, but which are sort of useful for flowers to be because other animals that they're interacting with can actually see them. So, for example, my word for blueberry isn't blueberry, it's actually like purple berry or ultraviolet colored berry. That's Kyakre. So then with the grammar, I just did a little syntax tree to illustrate this. In terms of sort of forming vocabulary, again comparing to chickadees, which actually have a decently analyzed syntax. My grandfather actually wrote some papers about how there's certain recursive elements of maybe not recursive, but just generally like rules as to how different chickadee calls are made. But unlike chickadee calls, whenever you hear a crow vocalizing, it's one syllable. So I wanted to put that in. And then of course there's reduplication forms a couple of different sort of morphological or syntactical functions. You have that iterative again, and then it's also used for a collective number. And then again, going back to the what do you call it? Going back to the design principles, I didn't have anything to work with how crows actually talk, so I just sort of made my own grammar. I thought that it might make sense to have everything right branching, so I just kind of did. Um, but yeah, I think that's an area where you have a lot more freedom than with the other things because I'm really dedicated to making sure that everything would be pronounceable by the type of animal. I think the one thing that I hand waved is birds usually don't have wide, strong tongues like humans do. So I figure, okay, this is a type of bird that has a really strong tongue. So just going into some of the sources I got this from, I started by sort of going through my university library trying to find sort of avian anatomy, anatomy of the respiratory system. Then I sort of moved on to looking at stuff on the internet. There's a lot of interesting stuff you could look at with sort of veterinary resources. If you're doing a language for a specific type of animal, you have to look at what their respiratory and digestive anatomy looks like. Found a fun blog, corvidresearch.blog. They have some interesting sort of behavioral notes, and then some of that ultraviolet light stuff. So then coming to the end, for special thanks, I want to thank the Conlang Discord network, which is a very good sort of social platform for talking about conlangs, and of course, the Crows of Ann Arbor, Michigan.
That is phenomenal. Thank you, Alex. You're getting a lot of praise in the YouTube comments. I encourage you to check those out. Perhaps my favorite was Stephen DeGrasse said, I got the torch in this language in the Conlang relay. I was like, oh shit, this is really hard, but I had a lot of fun with it. It's really cool and incredibly creative. I'm pumped for this talk. And there's a lot of people following that theme who are very excited to see this. A couple of people are very interested in following in your footsteps or have tried things like this in the past. So Christoph mentioned Lorinda J. Taylor has bird-like aliens in her stories with languages. Jamin noted that Desmond Ravenstone also has a bird conlang. Alplay in his novel Lemicorda, and A. Walker Scott noted that A.C. Crispin has a couple of novels with bird people who use signed languages, but no examples in texts. Are you familiar with any of these ones, and can you maybe compare if so?
I'm totally not familiar with them. I really need to check that kind of thing out. I think the first sort of introduction I had to this kind of thing was you, actually, Joey. In a previous LCC, you talked about for an RPG campaign, you did a little conlang for lizard-like people. And I just thought the idea of, oh, they have forked tongues, they just turn them over and go like that. I thought that was great, and I wanted to do something similar. But I wanted to really focus on the anatomy of sort of real world animals rather than sort of saying, okay, it's like a human, but it's like a human sort of vocal tract, but they have lizard features.
That's really cool. I'm impressed I could inspire. I appreciate that. Um, Fundrack uh, idea: does the morphology, as in the biomorphology, not the linguistic morphology, of their mouth change with age? And if so, could that imply a language change with age?
That would be interesting to have different. I mean, I think it would amount to a sociolect. Um, I, given that I've mostly looked at sort of chicks, but I think I've also seen a couple of sort of adult crows with their mouths open, and I don't think that the, in the case of the daws, it wouldn't um, change significantly, but yeah, I think that would be an interesting idea for you to explore. I don't know. For your own sort of different species. I don't know if like I can't imagine like an adult frog person trying to communicate with their frog tadpoles.
I wonder, and I mean this doesn't happen in humans, but does a bird's beak or oral cavity get longer between youth and adulthood than a human's between infancy and adulthood, and would that give them more ranges? I don't know. I'm just speculating.
I think the same places of articulation would be there the whole time, but it might have some acoustic effect.
Yeah. Okay. George Corley wanted to know: did you try looking at ultraviolet photos or videos to get an idea of what looking through these birds' eyes might actually look like when you're describing things?
Yes, and it was very interesting. I mentioned like I couldn't some of this ResearchGate stuff. I had two specific words in mind, um, which were, hold on, let me get my notes. Hold on. I had two words in mind, which were kyankra and hamra, which literally ultraviolet berry, which is the blueberry, because they just sort of, through their eyes they would be a lot more brightly colored, and obviously it's hard to sort of describe in words a color that you can't see, but I assume it would be somewhat similar to a purple color. So I'm thinking maybe um, this sort of color term, and color terms are super fascinating, but this sort of color term would also cover sort of things that we see as purple. But stuff like, and then the other word, hamra, it means like purple flint, but it's obsidian because, you know, if you're making tools, they have sort of similar uses, obsidian and flint. But yeah, those two things would be a lot brighter in color. And I don't know if you can sort of type in these links or if I can post them somewhere, but very interesting stuff. It's kind of hard to find, but it really sort of gives you a window into how these sort of fictional bird things would see the world.
I mean, feel free to copy paste them into the YouTube chat after we take a break. I'm sure everybody would be really interested in that. Uh, DWN, that I choose to pronounce Dawn. I don't know if that's true. Have you tried speaking this with any of the birds in Ann Arbor?
I think someone else joked about that, but I don't think they would understand me. I did have like this kind of humorous pipe dream of like getting a parrot and only talking to it in this language and like seeing if it could repeat after me and like if that would be sort of a purer form of it.
Sai just noted that if you copy paste those links into the Zoom chat when you're done, they will put them into the YouTube description, so they're even easier to find.
All right.
And that's all the questions I see from YouTube. Anybody on the Zoom screen have any questions? With nobody coming up, I'll ask mine, and that is, how hard was it to learn how to pronounce this language? Caveat being, obviously, you have a human anatomy, but did you find it really difficult to approximate it?
You cut out there a bit at first, but did you say how hard was it to something?
Sorry, you've been producing this language for us in examples. How hard was it to learn how to produce your own conlang?
Um, I don't think it was that hard. If I can go back to the most of these sounds are ones I'm familiar with. I actually came up with the palatal lateral series that was not in the language until pretty recently, but I don't think it was too difficult. I mentioned earlier I still kind of have trouble with the uh, switching between the different vowel qualities very quickly in between words. Um, and the funny thing I've added, just to have tons of tones, I have a difference between ah and ah. So it's the same sort of, it's a similar contour, but one of them starts higher one of them starts higher and one of them ends higher. And then there's the other thing, I'm not as good at clicks as some other people are. So like just for my sake, it's sort of baked into the phonotactics that any vowel that is following a click is automatically nasalized. So even if you have a creaky voiced vowel after a click, it's both nasalized and creaky, and that's the only place where that can occur.
You're making me feel better. My very first conlang, I had a very similar vowel distinction and clicks, and I learned very quickly that I cannot produce an oral vowel after a click. So I had to do this. So I'm glad it's not just me. We do have time for one last quick question, and it's from Yoshimitsu. I assume the idea of non-human grammar would improve over time as more and more research is put into the study of bird syntax. So do you think your ability to create the grammar and morph the grammar would improve as you were able to study more and more? Or do you think you have it where you want it?
Ah, see, as I said, I kind of just did some human syntax, and I tried to read some of those old um, papers that my grandfather wrote about chickadee syntax, but it's just impossible to know what each what each sort of part of the thing means. Like there are sort of I don't know if it's qualitative or quantitative. There are things that you can notice, like if there's like a larger animal, they if a bunch of chickadees are scared by a different animal, they might sort of sound slightly different. They might repeat something, and there are like certain sequences that are grammatical and not grammatical. And I think that's sort of the basis for his saying that it was similar to human language, that there were certain constraints like a grammar, but it's just impossible to know what the individual sounds and sequences encode, which is why I sort of just went for a kind of um, sort of regular right branching kind of thing. Although I did want to sort of make a lot of it's still pretty normal, human like in terms of actual grammar, which is why the grammar section was kind of short.
I still think it was awesome. So thank you very much, Alex. Um, I definitely suggest heading over to the YouTube to check out a lot of praise you're getting there and a couple other ideas and questions that are popping up.